If you dare to explore the darkest mysteries, subscribe now to Whispers in the Dark. Activate notifications and be prepared to hear whispers that may haunt you even in the silence of the night. Real stories, mysterious events, and spine-chilling tales. But beware, fear will always be your companion here. Click the subscribe button before it's too late. The mysterious date. I met Kaylee on a Sunday morning at church. It was one of those rare weekends where I actually woke up on time and felt compelled to go. She caught my attention immediately. Her auburn hair shimmered in the sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows, and her smile was warm but distant, like she was holding back a secret. After the service, I mustered up the courage to introduce myself. To my surprise, she seemed eager to talk. We spent nearly an hour outside, laughing about the awkward sermon and discovering we had a shared love for old jazz records. By the time we exchanged numbers, it felt like we'd known each other for years. Something about her felt magnetic. It was the kind of connection that makes you want to keep the momentum going, so I asked her out right then and there. She said yes. That Friday, I picked her up for our date. She lived on the outskirts of town, in a quiet neighborhood where the streetlights were sparse and the air smelled like damp leaves. She looked stunning in a simple navy dress, her eyes sparkling as she slid into the passenger seat of my car. The plan was casual, a quick bite to eat and then maybe a drive through the countryside. Everything started off normal, maybe even better than normal. We laughed so much at the diner that the waitress had to remind us to look at the menu. But as the night went on, something shifted. It wasn't obvious at first, just little things. Her long pauses before answering a question, the way she stared out the window like she was looking for something. By the time we left the diner, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. After dinner, we drove aimlessly for a while, following the winding roads that led out of town. The sky had turned a deep, inky black, with no moon in sight, and the only sound was the occasional crunch of gravel under the tires. Kaylee seemed calmer now, almost too calm. She leaned her head against the window, watching the passing trees with an expression I couldn't quite read. I tried to make small talk, but she gave vague answers, like her mind was somewhere else. Eventually, she turned to me and said, "Can we take that road?" pointing to a narrow dirt path I hadn't even noticed. It cut through the woods, barely wide enough for the car. I hesitated but nodded, figuring she wanted a little adventure. The GPS lost signal as soon as we turned, but Kaylee didn't seem to care. In fact, she smiled for the first time since we left the diner. The further we drove, the stranger she became. She started humming softly, a melody I didn't recognize, and then whispered something under her breath. At first, I thought she was talking to me, but her words didn't make any sense. They weren't in English, or at least not any language I'd ever heard. Her voice grew louder, almost urgent, and I glanced over, asking if she was okay. That's when I noticed her eyes. They were wide and unblinking, fixed straight ahead, but it was like she wasn't seeing anything. The humming turned into a low chant, rhythmic and unsettling, and my chest tightened with a mix of fear and confusion. I pulled the car to a stop, gripping the steering wheel as I tried to get her attention. "Kaylee, are you messing with me?" I asked, my voice shaking. She didn't respond. Instead, she opened the car door and stepped out into the darkness. I scrambled out of the car after her, my flashlight barely piercing through the dense woods surrounding us. "Kaylee, wait," I called out, my voice echoing into the stillness. She didn't seem to hear me. Her steps were deliberate, almost mechanical, as she moved deeper into the forest, her chant growing louder and more distorted. I tried to grab her arm, but she jerked away with a strength that caught me off guard. Her head tilted back, and she let out a strange, guttural sound that sent a shiver down my spine. It wasn't human. It sounded like a mix of growls and whispers layered together, almost like a dozen voices speaking at once. My instincts screamed at me to get back in the car, but something about her trance-like state made me feel responsible for her. I couldn't just leave her there. The deeper we went, the stranger things became. The air felt heavier, almost suffocating, and the forest around us seemed unnaturally quiet. No crickets, no wind, just the sound of her voice and my pounding heart. Suddenly, she stopped and turned to face me. Her eyes caught the beam of my flashlight, and for a split second, they didn't look right. They reflected back at me, like an animal's eyes caught in headlights. She smiled then, but it wasn't a normal smile. It was too wide, too forced, and her teeth, were they sharper than before? I took a step back, my hand tightening around the flashlight. "Kaylee, what's going on?" I whispered, but she didn't answer. Instead, she turned and sprinted into the woods, faster than I thought possible. Her chant faded as she disappeared into the darkness, leaving me standing there, paralyzed with fear. For a few moments, I just stood there, staring into the trees, trying to process what had just happened. My legs felt like they were glued to the ground, and my mind was racing with questions. Where was she going? Should I follow her? But the thought of running after her into that pitch-black forest sent a wave of dread through me. I shined my flashlight around, hoping to catch a glimpse of her, but all I could see were endless trees and shadows that seemed to twist and move as I tried to focus. Then, out of nowhere, I heard her voice again. Soft at first, like a distant echo. "Come find me," it said, clear and sharp, but it wasn't coming from one direction. It seemed to echo from everywhere at once. I called her name, my voice trembling. "Kaylee, where are you?" But instead of an answer, the woods erupted with a series of faint whispers. It sounded like dozens of people murmuring at once, their voices blending into a wave of eerie static. My flashlight flickered, the beam shrinking to a dim glow before going out entirely. Panic hit me like a punch to the gut. I fumbled with my phone, trying to use its flashlight, but it wouldn't turn on. The whispers grew louder, surrounding me, and I felt this overwhelming sense of being watched. Every hair on my body stood on end as I slowly turned in a circle, trying to spot something, anything. That's when I saw it, a faint glow deeper in the woods, like someone holding a lantern. I thought it had to be her, but as I squinted, I realized the light wasn't steady. It pulsed, almost like it was breathing. Against my better judgment, I moved toward the light, each step feeling heavier than the last. The glow was faint, almost like it was retreating as I got closer, but it seemed to guide me deeper into the woods. My heart pounded in my chest, and I kept calling Kaylee's name, though my voice sounded small and hollow against the oppressive silence. As I approached, I noticed something odd. The ground beneath my feet had changed. It was softer, almost spongy, and the air was thick with a metallic smell that made my stomach churn. The trees around me looked different too. Their trunks were twisted and gnarled, and some of them appeared to have faint carvings, symbols I didn't recognize but that sent an inexplicable wave of unease through me. Finally, I reached a small clearing where the light hovered, pulsating weakly. Kaylee was there, standing in the middle of the space, her back to me. Her dress was torn, and her hair hung limply around her shoulders. "Kaylee," I whispered, stepping closer, but she didn't react. She was muttering again, that same strange language from the car, her voice low and almost melodic. The light seemed to flicker in time with her words, casting eerie shadows that danced across the clearing. I was close enough now to see her hands. They were trembling, clutching something small and dark that I couldn't quite make out. My gut told me to leave, to turn around and run, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. I was frozen in place, watching as her chanting grew louder and more frantic. And then, without warning, she turned to face me. When she turned, I immediately wished she hadn't. Her face, it wasn't right. Her eyes were black, not just the pupils but the entire eye, like two bottomless pits. Her skin looked pale, almost translucent, and her expression was twisted into something between rage and ecstasy. She held up what was in her hands. It was a small object, crudely shaped like a figure, made of something dark and wet-looking, as though it had just been pulled from the earth. My stomach lurched at the sight of it. She tilted her head, studying me like I was the strange one. "You shouldn't have come," she said in a voice that wasn't hers. It was layered, distorted, as if multiple people were speaking through her at once. I stumbled back, tripping over a root and falling hard onto the damp ground. She didn't move, just stood there staring at me, the twisted figure still clutched in her hands. The pulsing light dimmed and then disappeared entirely, plunging us into complete darkness. "Kaylee, stop. You're scaring me," I shouted, my voice breaking. But the second the words left my mouth, she let out a piercing scream that didn't sound human. It echoed through the forest, shaking me to my core. I scrambled to my feet and ran, not caring which direction I was going, just desperate to get away. The whispers started again, louder this time, chasing me through the trees. I didn't dare look back, convinced that if I did, I'd see something I wouldn't survive. I ran until my lungs burned, until the forest around me blurred into a chaotic mess of shadows and branches clawing at my clothes. My heart felt like it was going to explode, but I didn't stop. The whispers seemed to follow me, their intensity rising and falling like waves crashing against my ears. At one point, I tripped again, falling face first into the dirt. As I scrambled to get up, I swore I felt something graze my ankle, a cold, claw-like touch that sent ice shooting through my veins. I didn't stop to check. I just bolted, forcing my legs to move even though they felt like lead. Eventually, I saw a faint glow in the distance and realized it was my car, still parked at the edge of the dirt road where I'd left it. When I reached the car, I fumbled with the keys, dropping them twice before finally unlocking the door and throwing myself inside. Slamming the door shut, I locked it and started the engine, my hand shaking so badly I could barely keep the wheel steady. As I peeled out of there, the road ahead of me blurred, and for a moment, I thought I saw Kaylee standing in the rearview mirror, backlit by that eerie light. But when I glanced again, she was gone. The drive home was a blur. I couldn't think straight, couldn't process what had just happened. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I just sat there in the car, shaking and staring at my hands, which were still dirty from the forest floor. I don't remember how I made it inside, but I know I locked every door and window as soon as I did. My house felt colder than usual, the silence almost as oppressive as the woods had been. I couldn't stop pacing, replaying everything in my mind, trying to make sense of it. Who, or what, was Kaylee? I debated calling someone, maybe the police, but what could I even tell them? That a girl I barely knew ran into the woods and started acting inhuman? They'd think I was insane. I grabbed my phone to at least try texting her, but when I opened our chat, her number was gone. Not just the messages. Her contact didn't exist anymore, like she'd never been in my phone at all. I barely slept that night, and when I finally did drift off, I had the worst nightmares. I was back in the woods, but this time, I was the one chanting. I woke up drenched in sweat, convinced I could still hear whispers in the distance. The next morning, I drove back to the church, desperate for answers. I asked around about Kaylee, describing her to everyone I could, but no one seemed to know who I was talking about. It was like she had never existed. Even the people who'd been sitting near us that Sunday morning gave me confused looks, swearing they didn't remember anyone matching her description. To this day, I can't explain what happened. I still dream about her sometimes, about the woods and that awful, pulsing light. And every now and then, when I'm driving at night, I swear I see her reflection in my rearview mirror, just for a split second. Always smiling. Desert encounter. I was driving through the Nevada desert late at night, trying to make it to Reno before the storm got worse. The weather had been on and off all day, but it wasn't until I was miles away from the nearest town that the sky completely opened up. Thunder shook the car, lightning flashed every few seconds, and the rain came down so hard that my windshield wipers just couldn't keep up. Then, as if the situation wasn't bad enough, they stopped working altogether. Just froze in place. I had no choice but to pull over, and let me tell you, there's nothing quite as unsettling as being completely alone in the middle of nowhere with a storm raging around you. I sat there for maybe 10 or 15 minutes, hoping the rain would let up. The occasional flash of lightning lit up the landscape, showing nothing but empty desert in every direction. But then, I noticed something strange in the distance. 2, maybe 3 little points of light bobbing around like flashlights. At first, I thought it might just be another car, but there was no sound of an engine or headlights cutting through the storm. The lights were moving toward me, zigzagging like whoever was holding them wasn't walking in a straight line. My stomach dropped. Who the hell would be out here in this weather? I kept watching the lights, hoping they'd veer off or disappear, but they didn't. They were getting closer. I locked my doors without even thinking and turned off the car's interior lights. I didn't want to be seen. My heart was pounding so hard that I could feel it in my ears. As the figures came into view, I could make out 3 of them, all holding flashlights, but their movements didn't make sense. Jerky, erratic, almost like they were drunk or something worse. One of them stumbled and then let out this loud laugh that cut through the storm, and I swear it made my skin crawl. Then, out of nowhere, one of them pulled out a gun and fired it straight into the air. The sound was deafening, even with the rain. I ducked down in my seat instinctively, my hand fumbling for my phone. I couldn't believe this was happening. I kept peeking up, and they were just standing there, maybe 20 feet from my car now, talking to each other in loud, almost angry voices. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but it was enough to make me call 911. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hit the numbers. The dispatcher picked up, and I tried to explain what was happening as quietly as I could, though I was sure the panic in my voice said it all. I whispered that there were 3 men outside my car with flashlights and a gun, and that I was stuck on a deserted stretch of highway in the middle of the storm. She told me to stay hidden, lock the doors, and wait for the police to arrive. She kept asking for landmarks or mile markers, but there was nothing. I couldn't see anything but the storm and the faint glow of their flashlights. I muttered, "Please hurry," over and over. Just as I thought things couldn't get worse, one of them started walking straight toward my car. He was close enough now that I could see his face in the brief flashes of lightning, scruffy, wide-eyed, and grinning like he knew I was there. My stomach turned. He banged on the driver's side window with his flashlight, hard enough that I thought the glass might crack. I stayed as low as I could, barely breathing, hoping he'd give up. But then he started yelling, something incoherent that I couldn't make out over the rain. My phone slipped from my sweaty hands, and I scrambled to grab it, afraid they might hear even that small noise. As I stayed crouched down, the banging on the window suddenly stopped. For a moment, I thought maybe he'd given up, but then I heard footsteps circling the car. My heart was racing so fast I thought I might pass out. Another flash of lightning lit up the area, and I could see 2 of them standing at the back of my car now, talking to each other and pointing at something. Maybe my tires or the trunk. The third guy was still near the driver's side, but thankfully, he'd stepped back a bit. I tried to remember everything the dispatcher said. Stay hidden, stay quiet, the cops are on their way. But when you're in the middle of something like that, it feels like time slows to a crawl. It felt like hours, but it must have been minutes later when I finally saw something in the distance. Red and blue lights cutting through the rain. Relief washed over me so fast that I almost cried. The men must have seen it too because they started freaking out. One of them shouted, and they all bolted into the desert, their flashlights bouncing wildly before disappearing into the darkness. I stayed huddled in the car, frozen, until I heard a knock on the window. This time, it was the police. I unlocked the door with trembling hands, barely able to explain what had happened as they looked around with their own flashlights. But those guys were gone. Just gone. The cops asked me a bunch of questions. What I'd seen, what they looked like, and whether I'd gotten a good look at the vehicle they might have come from. I told them everything I could, but the truth was, I hadn't seen a car or anything else that made sense. It was like those three guys just materialized out of the desert. One officer said they'd drive up and down the highway to look for any signs of them, but I could tell they didn't think they'd find much. After all, the storm had already wiped out most of the footprints or any other evidence they might have left behind. By the time they let me go, it was close to sunrise, and the storm had finally passed. The cops suggested I follow them to the nearest town since my nerves were shot, and honestly, I didn't argue. Even with them driving ahead of me, I kept looking in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see those flashlights again. It felt like they were still out there, watching, waiting for me to be alone again. When I finally reached a motel and locked myself in my room, I just sat there, staring at the door, unable to sleep. I still don't know what those guys wanted or why they ran as soon as help arrived, but I've never driven through the desert at night again, and I never will. The strange tourist town. I'll never forget that trip. What started as a fun road adventure with my best friend Carol turned into something I still can't explain. This happened last spring, around late April. We were driving from Florida to New Jersey, taking our time and stopping wherever we felt like it. Carol and I had been friends since college, and we loved the idea of just hitting the open road with no strict schedule. We'd planned to stay overnight at motels along the way and visit random little touristy spots for laughs and photo ops. I mean, that was the vibe, easygoing and spontaneous. Neither of us could have expected how weird things would get. It was sometime after noon when we found the town. We'd been on a quiet back road for a while, looking for somewhere to stretch our legs and grab something to eat. I remember we spotted the town sign, a plain wooden board with the name Colchester painted in faded green letters. It wasn't on the map, but that wasn't unusual for small places like this. The main street looked like something out of an old postcard, lined with shops and quaint buildings. But as we drove in, something felt off. At first, I couldn't put my finger on it, but there was this strange stillness, like everything was too quiet. There were cars parked along the street, but no one walking around. We parked near what looked like a diner, one of those classic ones with a chrome exterior and a big neon sign. Except the neon wasn't on, and the windows were smudged, like no one had cleaned them in years. Inside, the booths were empty, and the counter stools sat in perfect rows, untouched. I joked that we'd stumbled into a ghost town, but Carol didn't laugh. She just said, "Let's check it out anyway. Maybe they're closed for lunch or something." That didn't make much sense, but I shrugged it off. We decided to explore the other shops, hoping to find at least a convenience store or somewhere with snacks. The first store we walked into was a tiny souvenir shop. You know the kind, with shelves full of snow globes, postcards, and cheap trinkets. Behind the counter was a middle-aged man with a tired face, wearing a red flannel shirt. He barely looked up as we walked in, just gave a distracted "hey" before going back to fiddling with a cash register. We didn't stay long. The vibe was weird, and the place smelled faintly of mildew. When we stepped back out into the sunlight, I noticed Carol was unusually quiet, her arms crossed like she was uncomfortable. We moved down the street and went into a general store a few doors down. The second I stepped inside, I froze. Behind the counter was the same man in the same red flannel shirt, fiddling with a register in the same distracted way. I thought I was losing it. I turned to Carol, my heart racing, and whispered, "That's the guy from the souvenir shop. He looks exactly the same." Carol frowned at me like I was crazy, but then she glanced back at him, and her face went pale. "Let's go," she muttered, grabbing my arm. I didn't argue. As we left, I glanced over my shoulder, and the man was watching us now, his head tilted slightly like he'd heard what I said. The air outside felt heavy, like a storm was about to break. That was weird, right? I asked Carol as we hurried back to the car. She just nodded, biting her lip. I could tell she was as freaked out as I was, but didn't want to say it. Maybe he's got a twin or something, she finally said, but her voice didn't sound convinced. We decided to leave the main street and head to a gas station we'd seen on the way in. The car's tank was half full, but neither of us wanted to risk running out in the middle of nowhere. The gas station was old and run down, with peeling paint and a single pump. When we pulled in, there wasn't a soul in sight, which wasn't surprising given how quiet the rest of the town had been. I stayed in the car while Carol got out to pump the gas. I couldn't shake this gnawing unease in my stomach, like we were being watched. As Carol fiddled with the pump, something changed. I didn't notice it at first, but when I looked up, the gas station wasn't empty anymore. People were standing there, dozens of them, just standing. They weren't talking or moving, just staring at us. Some were close to the pump, while others lingered near the edges of the lot. It didn't make sense. They hadn't been there a minute ago. "Carol," I hissed, rolling down the window just enough to get her attention. She turned around, saw them, and froze. "Get in the car," I whispered, trying to keep my voice steady, but she didn't move. Carol snapped out of it and scrambled back into the car, slamming the door so hard it made me jump. "Drive," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't argue. I threw the car into gear and sped out of the station, tires screeching against the cracked asphalt. As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The people were still standing there, watching us go, their faces blank and expressionless. Not a single one of them moved, not even to step out of the way. It felt like they weren't real, like they were mannequins someone had just dropped into place. We didn't talk for a while, the silence in the car almost as suffocating as the tension in that gas station. But as we hit the outskirts of town, something even stranger happened. The sunlight shifted, like the sky was skipping ahead in time. 1 second it was bright and golden, the next it was dim, almost like twilight. "What the hell is going on?" Carol muttered, gripping the armrest. I checked the clock on the dashboard. It was frozen at 3:17 p.m. The car's radio crackled with static, even though it had been off before. A chill ran down my spine. We drove faster, desperate to put as much distance as possible between us and that town. But no matter how far we went, it felt like we weren't getting anywhere. The scenery outside the windows, the trees, the cracked road, the occasional abandoned building, it all looked exactly the same, like we were driving in circles. Carol was gripping the dashboard, her knuckles white, while I kept glancing at the fuel gauge. It was dropping faster than it should have been, and I could feel panic creeping in. "This doesn't make sense," I muttered, more to myself than to her. "We should have hit a highway by now." Then, out of nowhere, the van appeared. It came up behind us, its headlights glaring in the rearview mirror. At first, I thought it was just another traveler, someone who could help us if we flagged them down. But the longer it followed us, the more uneasy I felt. The van stayed close, too close, tailing us no matter how much I sped up or slowed down. Carol turned around to get a better look, and her face went pale. "Mary," she said, her voice trembling, "I think it's the same van we saw parked in the town." I glanced back again, and my stomach dropped. She was right. The van's rusty exterior and dented bumper were unmistakable. Worse, through the windshield, I could see a figure in the driver's seat, but the windows were so dark I couldn't make out their face. "What do they want?" I whispered, my voice shaky. Carol didn't answer, and for a moment, the only sound was the roar of the engine and the static still crackling from the radio. I pushed the gas pedal harder, the speedometer creeping up past 80 miles per hour, but the van stayed glued to our bumper. It felt predatory, like it was hurting us somewhere. "We have to lose them," Carol said, her voice sharp with panic. but there wasn't anywhere to turn. The road stretched endlessly ahead, straight and narrow, with no signs or turnoffs. My hands were slick with sweat as I gripped the steering wheel. I could feel my heartbeat pounding in my ears, louder than the engine. Then, the radio cut out completely, leaving an eerie silence that made my skin crawl. Suddenly, Carol screamed. I jerked my head toward her, and she was pointing ahead. The road ended abruptly in what looked like a wall of thick fog, so dense it was almost solid. There was no time to stop. I slammed on the brakes, but the car skidded, the tires screeching as we hurtled toward the fog. "Hold on," I yelled, bracing myself for impact. But instead of crashing, we plunged into the fog, the temperature dropping instantly. It was freezing, and I could barely see the hood of the car. The van's headlights disappeared behind us, swallowed by the mist. We emerged from the fog, but the world around us wasn't the same anymore. The road was different, no longer the cracked asphalt of the back roads, but a smooth black surface, almost too perfect, like it had just been laid. The trees were gone, replaced by an endless field of tall grass that seemed to ripple under an invisible wind. The sky was a deep, murky gray, with no sun or clouds, just an unsettling, uniform color. Carol and I exchanged a glance, and I could see the same terror I felt mirrored in her wide eyes. "Where are we?" she whispered, her voice trembling. I had no answer. The car's dashboard was completely dead. No clock, no speedometer, nothing. I slowed to a crawl, scanning the strange landscape for any sign of life. Then, in the distance, I saw it. The van. It was parked in the middle of the road, facing us, as if it had been waiting. The driver's side door opened, and a figure stepped out. They were tall and thin, wearing a dark coat that billowed slightly in the windless air. I couldn't make out their face. It was blurred, like looking through frosted glass. My blood ran cold as they started walking toward us, slow and deliberate. "Go," Carol shouted, snapping me out of my paralysis. I slammed my foot on the gas, and the car lurched forward. The figure didn't flinch. They kept walking toward us, calm and steady, like they had all the time in the world. As we sped past the van, I caught a glimpse of its license plate. It didn't have numbers or letters, just a series of strange symbols I couldn't recognize, like something carved into ancient stone. The sight made my stomach churn, but I couldn't dwell on it. The figure had turned to watch us as we sped away, and even though I couldn't see their eyes, I felt their gaze. We drove for what felt like hours, but the scenery never changed. The endless field, the gray sky, the smooth black road, it was like we were stuck in a loop. Carol was gripping the door handle so tightly I thought she might rip it off. "This isn't real," she muttered under her breath, over and over, like a mantra. I wanted to agree with her, but it felt too real, the chill in the air, the ache in my hands from clutching the wheel. Then, without warning, the car sputtered. The engine coughed and died, leaving us coasting to a stop. "No, no, no," I shouted, frantically turning the key, but it was useless. We were stranded. The silence was deafening once the engine cut out. I looked at Carol, and she was shaking her head, her lips pressed into a thin line like she was trying not to cry. "We can't stay here," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I nodded, even though I had no idea where we could possibly go. The road stretched endlessly in both directions, and the air felt heavier with each passing second, like the atmosphere itself was pressing down on us. Then we heard it, the crunch of footsteps on the asphalt. Slow, deliberate, and getting closer. Carol grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice breaking. I nodded, too afraid to speak. The footsteps grew louder, and when I turned my head, I saw them again. The figure in the dark coat, walking toward us from the direction we had just come. But it didn't make sense. We had left them behind miles ago. There was no way they could have caught up, not on foot. My breath hitched as they stopped a few feet from the car, their head tilting slightly, like they were studying us. I wanted to move, to get out or run, but my body wouldn't cooperate. Carol was the first to move. She fumbled with her seatbelt, her shaking hands making it harder than it should have been. "We have to run," she said through gritted teeth. I hesitated, my eyes still locked on the figure. They were standing completely still, but something about their presence felt wrong. The air around them seemed distorted, like a mirage shimmering on a hot day. "Mary!" Carol's shout snapped me out of my daze. I unbuckled my seatbelt, my movements clumsy with fear, and we both scrambled out of the car. The figure didn't move, just stood there watching us. We ran. I don't know where we thought we were going, but the urge to get away was stronger than any sense of logic. The tall grass on either side of the road brushed against us as we sprinted, our footsteps echoing unnaturally in the heavy silence. Every few seconds, I glanced back, expecting the figure to be right behind us, but they weren't. That should have been comforting, but it wasn't. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still following us. Maybe not physically, but somehow their presence was wrapped around us like a shadow. As we ran, the road began to change. The smooth black surface cracked and crumbled, splitting apart into uneven slabs of stone. The tall grass on either side faded into barren dirt, and the gray sky darkened into a deep, suffocating black. It felt like the world was unraveling around us, but there was no turning back. Carol stumbled ahead of me, nearly falling, but I grabbed her arm and pulled her up. "Keep going," I shouted, though my own lungs were burning, and my legs felt like lead. Every step felt harder, like the ground was trying to pull us down. Then we saw it, a faint glow in the distance. It was the first sign of light we'd seen since entering this strange place, and it filled me with a desperate hope. "There!" I yelled, pointing toward it. Carol nodded, her breath ragged, and we pushed ourselves toward the light. As we got closer, it became clear what it was, a small gas station, almost identical to the one we'd stopped at earlier. It was lit up like a beacon in the endless darkness, the fluorescent lights flickering slightly. My stomach twisted at the sight, but it was our only option. We stumbled into the gas station, panting and drenched in sweat. The inside was eerily quiet, just like the one from before, but this time the shelves were fully stocked with random items: cans of soup, dusty snacks, and bottles of water. It all looked untouched, like it had been sitting there for years. The fluorescent lights above buzzed faintly, casting an unnatural, pale glow over everything. Carol immediately grabbed a bottle of water from the shelf and twisted it open, gulping it down like she'd been stranded in the desert. I was about to do the same when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The cashier was the same man from the souvenir shop and the general store, the same flannel shirt, the same vacant expression. He was standing perfectly still behind the counter, his hands resting flat on its surface. His eyes weren't on us. They were fixed on the door, as if waiting for someone or something to come in. "Carol," I whispered, my voice shaking, "it's him. Again." She turned to look and dropped the bottle she was holding. The sound of it hitting the floor echoed unnaturally, like it was bouncing off invisible walls. The man's head snapped toward us in one sharp motion, and his blank eyes met mine. Carol grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin as she whispered, "We need to get out of here. Now." I nodded, but my feet wouldn't move. The man behind the counter was staring at us, his head tilted slightly like he was trying to figure us out. His expression was eerily calm, but his eyes, they didn't look human. They were too dark, like polished onyx, with no light reflecting off them. My chest tightened as a thought crept into my mind. What if we can't leave? The bell above the door suddenly jingled, the sound sharp and jarring in the stillness. Carol and I both spun around to see who, or what, had come in. But there was no one there. The door was closed, the darkness outside pressing against the glass like it was alive. "This place isn't real," Carol muttered, more to herself than to me. "None of this is real." I didn't have the words to argue with her because, deep down, I was starting to believe it too. The lights flickered again, this time longer, plunging us into brief moments of darkness. Each time the room lit up again, something felt different. The shelves seemed to shift slightly, their angles off kilter, and the man behind the counter was now standing closer, even though we hadn't seen him move. Carol gripped my arm tighter, her breathing shallow and fast. "We're not safe here," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the buzzing of the lights. I nodded, but every instinct in me screamed that running wouldn't make a difference anymore. Then, the static returned. It started faintly, crackling through unseen speakers, and grew louder, more distorted, like voices were buried inside it. I turned toward the sound, and that's when I saw it. The van. It was parked outside, its headlights cutting through the blackness, illuminating the front of the gas station. My stomach dropped. I couldn't tell if someone was inside, but I felt the same suffocating presence as before. "We need to go," I said, my voice shaking. Carol hesitated for a split second before nodding. We bolted for the door, pushing it open with all our strength. The moment we stepped outside, the air felt different. Heavier, colder, like it was trying to push us back. The van's headlights blazed into my eyes, making it hard to see, but I could feel something in the darkness beyond them. Carol grabbed my hand, pulling me toward the road. "Run!" she screamed, her voice breaking with desperation. We sprinted down the black, featureless road, the van's engine roaring to life behind us. It wasn't just following us now, it was chasing us, its tires screeching as it closed the distance. I glanced back, and for the first time, I saw them, the driver. Their face was completely featureless, smooth and blank like a mannequin's, with no eyes, no mouth, no expression. My chest tightened with pure terror, and I stumbled, nearly pulling Carol down with me. The van was getting closer, its headlights cutting through the dark like two eyes bearing down on us. "It's not real," Carol kept repeating, but I could feel the heat from the engine, hear the growl of the tires, and it felt very real. Then, just as the van was about to reach us, the ground beneath our feet changed. It went from smooth asphalt to soft dirt, and the sound of the van's engine vanished. I turned around, expecting it to be right behind us, but there was nothing. The road, the van, the gas station, all of it was gone. We were standing in the middle of a forest clearing, the trees towering above us, their branches twisting together to block out the sky. The only sound was the rustling of leaves in a faint, unnatural wind. Carol and I stood there, frozen, struggling to catch our breath. My heart was hammering so hard I thought it might burst. "What just happened?" she whispered, her voice shaking. I couldn't answer. The forest around us felt wrong. Too quiet, too still. The trees were impossibly tall, their trunks warped and gnarled like something out of a nightmare. There was no sign of the road, no sign of the van, and yet the oppressive feeling that we were being watched hadn't left. If anything, it had grown stronger. I grabbed Carol's hand, needing to feel something solid and real. "We can't stay here," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. She nodded, her face pale, and we started walking. The ground was soft beneath our feet, covered in damp moss that seemed to squish unnaturally with each step. As we moved deeper into the forest, the air grew colder, and a strange fog began to roll in, swirling around our ankles. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see the featureless driver or the dark-coated figure emerge from the mist. Then we heard it, a faint sound like the hum of an engine, but far away. It was coming from somewhere ahead of us. Carol stopped, her grip on my hand tightening. "No," she said, shaking her head. "I'm not going toward that." I wanted to agree with her, but something in me was drawn to the sound, like it was the only way out. "We have to," I said, though my voice barely carried any conviction. With every step closer, the hum grew louder, and the fog thickened until we could barely see each other. The hum grew louder, vibrating through the fog, and then it shifted. It wasn't just an engine anymore. It was a mix of mechanical noise and something else, like distorted voices layered underneath. The sound sent chills racing down my spine, but we kept moving, our steps hesitant and uneven. Suddenly, a dim light pierced through the fog ahead of us. It wasn't bright, more like a faint glow, but it was enough to guide us. "Do you see that?" I asked Carol, my voice barely above a whisper. She nodded, her face drawn tight with fear. As we approached the light, the fog began to thin, revealing something that stopped me in my tracks. It was the gas station again. But this time, it wasn't run down or eerie. It looked brand new, pristine even, with bright lights glowing from every window. The pump outside gleamed as if it had just been polished, and the sign above the door flashed a friendly "Open" in bold neon letters. It was completely out of place in the middle of this impossible forest. "No," Carol said firmly, stepping back. "We're not going in there again." But the hum was louder now, almost deafening, and it seemed to be pulling us toward the building, whether we wanted to go or not. "I don't think we have a choice," I whispered, my voice trembling. Carol looked at me, her eyes wide with fear, but she didn't argue. We edged closer to the gas station, every instinct in my body screaming at me to turn around, to run. But where would we go? The forest seemed endless, the fog thickening again behind us as if it were closing off our escape. The hum vibrated in my chest, almost like a heartbeat, syncing with the unease that had taken over my entire body. The door to the gas station opened on its own as we approached, the small bell above it ringing cheerfully. Inside, everything was impossibly clean and bright, the shelves stocked with products that seemed too perfect, shiny, untouched, and all labeled with names I didn't recognize. Behind the counter, there was no cashier this time, just an empty stool. The air smelled faintly of something sweet, like flowers, but it felt wrong, artificial, almost cloying. "This is a trap," Carol muttered, her voice shaking. But before I could respond, the hum abruptly stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating, and then the lights flickered. Once, twice. When they steadied, I saw them again, the figure in the dark coat, standing at the back of the store, completely still, their blurred face turned toward us. "Get out," Carol screamed, grabbing my arm, but when we turned to run, the door was gone. Where it had been was now just a blank wall. My heart sank as I stared at the blank wall where the door had been moments ago. Carol was tugging at my arm, her panic palpable. "This can't be happening," she said, her voice cracking. The figure in the dark coat didn't move, but the air in the room grew heavier, colder. It was like the walls were closing in, the fluorescent lights casting harsh, unnatural shadows that seemed to stretch and twist toward us. I grabbed Carol's hand, trying to steady both of us. "We need to find another way out," I said, though I had no idea where to start. Then, the figure moved. It wasn't a normal motion, no steps or shifting of weight. They just glided forward, closing the distance between us in a way that made my skin crawl. Their face was still blurred, like a smudge on glass, but I could feel their gaze, heavy and piercing. "Stay back," I shouted, though my voice sounded weak, swallowed by the oppressive air. The figure stopped, tilting its head slightly as if considering my words. Then, without warning, the shelves around us began to topple. Products spilled to the floor, shattering and scattering like the room itself was rejecting us. The crashing shelves sent us into a frenzy. Carol screamed, ducking as cans and bottles rained down. I grabbed her wrist and pulled her toward the back of the store, where a narrow hallway stretched into the unknown. It wasn't there before, I was sure of it, but at this point, questioning what was real felt pointless. "Come on," I shouted, dragging her along as we stumbled through the cluttered aisle. The hum returned, louder than ever, rattling the walls and making it hard to think. Behind us, I could hear the figures' steady, deliberate movements. They weren't running, they didn't need to. The hallway was worse than the main room. The walls were too close together, the ceiling too low, and the light too dim. It felt like walking into the throat of some giant beast. The hum echoed here, reverberating through the narrow space. Carol was crying now, whispering prayers under her breath. "We'll find a way out," I lied, though I wasn't sure I believed it myself. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly, and I started to feel like we were moving in place, no closer to escape than when we started. And then we reached a door. A single unmarked door at the end of the hall, its surface old and wooden, a stark contrast to the modern gas station. Without thinking, I turned the handle and pushed it open, yanking Carol through with me. We stumbled into blinding light, and for a moment, I thought we were free. But as my eyes adjusted, I realized we weren't outside. We were back in the car, parked in the middle of the road, as if none of it had happened. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The car was exactly as we'd left it, the dashboard glowing faintly, the keys still in the ignition. The road stretched out in both directions, lined with the same trees we'd seen before. It was as if we had never left, but the silence inside the car was suffocating. Carol was gripping the door handle so tightly her knuckles had turned white. "Mary," she said finally, her voice barely audible. "What just happened?" I opened my mouth to answer, but I didn't know what to say. My hands trembled as I turned the key, and the engine sputtered to life like nothing had happened. The clock on the dashboard read 3:17 p.m., exactly the time it had frozen before. But when I checked my phone, it was midnight. The realization made my stomach churn. Carol grabbed my arm, her voice sharp. "Look." She was pointing at the rear-view mirror. In the distance, barely visible through the trees, was the van. Its headlights were off, but it was there, motionless, as if watching us. My breath caught in my throat. "We're leaving," I said, and this time, I floored it. We didn't stop driving until we reached the next highway, the van never appearing again. We pulled into a brightly lit rest stop and sat in the car for hours, too shaken to move. Eventually, I drove us the rest of the way to New Jersey, but we didn't talk about what happened. Not during the drive, not when we reached our destination. To this day, I don't know if Carol remembers it the same way I do. We don't bring it up. But sometimes, when I'm alone, I hear that hum. It's faint, distant, like it's coming from somewhere just beyond my reach. And every time, I wonder if we really escaped, or if we're just waiting for whatever's out there to find us again.